Hello, welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, on what was a beautiful sunny day. Only mid-60s, but that's okay. I didn't sweat a lot today, even though I was in the shop pretty much all day. Every morning I have to decide what I should do, what I could do, what I want to do, and this morning's decision was pretty simple. The 55 Chevy, the street 55 Chevy, has been in the shop already longer than I wanted it to be, going on at least 3 weeks, I think. I haven't worked on it steady because there's always other things to do, but we went through a rainy stretch, end of April, beginning of May, and now the good weather is upon us, and my son, who's in the middle school now, his middle school and high school, have been putting on a car show since before I had a license. And I've never actually participated in it. I go almost every year. I go early, I walk around. It's quite a bit of walking. And I've never, now that I think about it, actually entered a vehicle in it. So he wants to. He mentioned it several times. He mentioned it again today, that he'd really like if we could take the 55. So I had a list to start with, found all kinds of other things that got me off track, like I wasn't expecting to have to remount the engine. So this morning I decided I need to, what do they call it, a punch list? Things that absolutely need to be done so I can enjoy the summer driving it, and we'll hit the mods again in the fall maybe. Or maybe sporadically here and there. But left to do, big things this morning was, and they're really not that big, but again, I was out in the shop by 8:30. It's now 7:45 at night, and other than stopping to eat, one test drive with my son, I'll get to that, I've been working on it steady. So the first thing I did was the lower ball joint boots. I mean, the car has 4,056 miles if the odometer is accurate, since it was pulled from a field and rebuilt. It has brand new tubular control arms. I believe they're CCP brand. Just to guess, the master cylinder is, the steering box is, maybe he bought all the stuff together. I didn't ask. It's that or Speedway. But clearly, the boots themselves are junk, because here it is 4,000 miles later and they're both split. This one's well on its way to completely splitting. This one is completely split. I have in stock, over the years I bought lots of the poly kits, you know, the bushings and boots and stuff like that. So I had some ball joint boots, fortunately. All I had to do was change them. On a 55 or Tri-5 Chevy, the studs on all four ball joints point down. On a typical, Chevy later model, they face each other, which is actually easier to work on, excuse me, than having them both point in the same direction. So I knew with the car hanging on the left, control arms drooping down, I couldn't just disconnect the bottom, plus you have the spring to deal with. Now the car has QA1 coilovers. Hang on, I gotta get a drink. I'm gonna cough again. That's better. But the coilovers still had some tension on them, so the easiest thing to do was to remove the cotter pins on all four castle nuts, loosen the nuts, and then lower the car down on jack stands just on the front, kind of precariously hanging on the left, but it's only a few feet off the ground at this point, so. And to sit on a stool, and if you hold on to the spindle, after you break it loose with a hammer. A lot of people don't know this, but a pickle fork or tie rod separator, they just destroy the boots. If you're replacing them, that's great, but that's not the best method. If you strike on whatever the tapered, like a tie rod or the ball joint, if you strike the metal on the outside, just one quick sharp blow, leave the nut on to catch it, they fall right apart. I couldn't believe that back when I was a young teenager when a buddy of mine showed me that because his dad had showed him how to do it. So I've never used a pickle fork or anything else to separate any suspension part. Just whack it with a hammer, no damage, falls right apart. So I was able to lower it down, swap these out, no big deal. It just took time. While I was doing that, I noticed it has a Speedway brake kit, disc brake conversion on the front. I know because the calipers say Speedway. And when it was assembled, the O-rings weren't lubed that keep the caliper from rattling, and one was hanging out of one of the holes. I looked around in all my brake stuff, and believe it or not, I didn't have one, but I was able to put that O-ring back in, lube it properly, put it back together. So another thing I had to fix, just takes more time. And it was on to alignment. I've mentioned in the past, but I'm going to go over my strategy for today's alignment. Pretty simple. I have a caster camber gauge, never got it out of the box. I did use my toe plates because it's actually easier than my trammel for setting toe by yourself, but I'm jumping ahead. Well, not really. You have to, before I even started, I loosened up the tie rod adjusters. Fortunately on this car, it has a hex tube and lock nuts instead of the traditional clamps, and you know what I'm talking about with the split rig. This has an aftermarket, I guess, tubular adjuster, super sweet. So left and right hand nuts, broke it loose, spun the nuts away. It was free on both sides because it's brand new. And you have to do that because my strategy, I've mentioned this before, I want as much caster as mechanically possible. So I have to cock the control arm, add shims to the rear bolt closest to the firewall. I need to move the upper ball joint toward the firewall. So it was assembled, and the guy told me when I bought it, or after I talked about the alignment with him, he shimmed the upper A-arms till the tires were straight up and down, and then he set the toe, and that was it. And it had equal shims front and back. And the problem with the alignment is, the faster you went, it didn't return. When you turn, it kept turning. There was no caster to straighten the wheel back out. And the faster you went, the worse that situation got. So I know a Tri-5 Chevy, it's not like you can dial in 10 degrees of caster. So I knew if I went all the caster I could manage, I probably have 3 or 4 degrees. I didn't measure it. Doesn't matter. I want all the mechanical caster I can get. Period. I can't go any more than the bolts are going to allow me. And I still have to end up with the tires straight up and down. So looking at the tires before I started the alignment, they're perfect. So I knew that the camber was fine. I only had a caster problem, and my toe must be good because, again, no wear on the tires whatsoever. They look like you just put them on. So I stuck this on the rotor, and before I let it down onto the jack stands and after I let it down on the jack stands, I was dead center in the bubble. The camber was pretty much zero. Perfect. Looking at the shim pack, long story short, I left one in the front, 1/8 inch shim, and I added a 1/4 inch of shims in the back on both sides. Both sides of the same shim pack. And while doing this, you have to, because when you start moving the control arm, the upper control arm, the toe end starts going crazy. And if you want it to get a good visual and a good measurement, you have to keep the front wheels pointing straight ahead. So I already had the steering wheel centered, and while I was adjusting the upper control arm, I keep turning the adjuster on the tie rod, so my wheels are just pointing straight ahead, or the rotor, the bare rotor, but I'm just eyeballing it. But you can't let it get all cockeyed because your measurements are going to be off. That's the only trick if there is. So I just kept them pointing straight ahead. I mechanically moved as much caster into it as possible, and with the one shim I left in the front, when I tightened up the nuts, I was once again center in the bubble. Then I let it down, had to put the wheels and tires back on it, set it all the way on the ground, And my toe plates, I've showed them to you, they're Longacre brand. I think I bought them at Speedway. They just, aluminum plate just sits against the front tire on both sides. It came with 2 tape measures, and one side plate, the opposite side of you, has a magnet to hold the tape measure. So you literally lean it against the tire, you stretch out a couple tape measures, you run it through the other one, and it's direct reading. So in this case, I had 70 inches in the back and 69 7/8 in the front. So I'm towed in 1/8 of an inch. Perfect. And no, it wasn't like that the first time I measured it. That was my final numbers. On a rear-wheel drive car, you tow in the front tires because as you drive, they're naturally going to want to straighten out. If you start towed out, it's only going to get worse. Now, in a front-wheel drive car, where the axles drive, you actually tow out the front tires in equal amount, in 1/8 to 3/16. And when they're driving, believe it or not, they go ahead enough to not wear the tires out. Seems hard to believe, but that's the way it is. So I'd love to tell you it came out perfect. It does. It drives as good as probably a Tri-5 Chevy does. I can let go of the wheel at 75 in a corner, and it actually straightens itself out. You have to keep steering. It doesn't want to keep going like a shopping cart. So that part was perfect, but I was upset that my wheel was about 5 degrees off from being flat. Now, I hate the steering wheel in it, but it wasn't crooked before. So if you've already set the toe, which I have hex adjusters, like I mentioned, so I put it back on the lift, which is hard over this car because when it's at ride height, you can't get the lift under the front frame. It sits low. So you jack it up with a floor jack, you put the arms under it, back in the air. I marked my hex adjusters on my tie rods, and if you think about it, the wheel was this way, so if I turned it straight, my wheels are now pointing left, so I went a half a turn with each tire. I just marked the hex, spun it a half a turn, making the wheel go to the right. And then I drove it, and now it's perfectly straight. So about this much was a half a turn on both adjusters. I didn't change the toe in, I moved both adjusters the same amount. You could do that as often as needed to make the wheel straight. So I mentioned before, my first video ever was an alignment video, probably the worst video ever shot on anybody's channel on YouTube. I leave it up there, just occasionally I watch it, and I'd like to think I've come somewhere from that, but who knows. So I got some shims I can put back in my shim box, and that part was done, but the day's work was not. There was a whole list of things I've noticed while working on it. Wires rubbing here and there, the speedometer cable melting on the exhaust, and about 50 other things that I fixed. I mean, again, not a knock on the guy. If I put the car together, the same thing. Things move, you know what I mean? And speaking of moving, I was so glad when I let the car back down on the wheels and tires, I watched the door gap close up. That's how flexible the frame and body is on a hard top Chevy. And now the door's shut with your finger again. I was nervous hanging on the lift for 3 weeks. It may never come back, but I've had it back on the lift 3 or 4 times. I watch it separate when I pick it up and come back together when I put it back down. If I was ever to put a roll cage in it, you better do it on the 4 tires when you weld it up, because otherwise nothing's ever going to fit. So it was just about time for my son to get home after working on the laundry list and having it up and down on the lift a few times. So I had the air cleaner off several times since I've owned it, but to fix the throttle linkage and a bunch of other stuff. But today I forget what I was doing. I guess I was rerouting the plug wires or something. And I put it back on. It's a low profile air cleaner. Not required on a Tri-5 Chevy because you could put a tunnel ram with air cleaners and still close the hood. And I went to back it out of the garage. Actually, I went to pump it twice to start it, and the throttle hung wide open. Now, I've driven the car quite a bit, so it's gone 4,000 miles with air cleaner on it. Today, it decides to hang the throttle wide open, so I immediately took this thing off and found a smaller one, and that'll be a swap meet item before you know it. So I took my son for a quick ride just to make him happy. I was glad the wheel was now straight, and I had not swapped out the valve covers yet. They were loose, so I tightened them up and hoping after I drove it, we went probably 5 miles up the road and back, so maybe a 10-mile round trip. And I parked it in the garage and went and made dinner, came back out and there's oil on the floor because let me think of it, the driver's side is leaking. It's running right out of the back of it, so. Thinking what to do next, I decided it would come out a lot better. I have a new set of valve covers I'm going to put on. I was going to machine off the stroker. It says 383 stroker. I was going to machine off the stroker. I only have a short amount of time tomorrow morning, so I decided to wash the engine, simple green it, and then I washed the whole car. That's where the thumbnail came from. I just finished washing it. Took it for a quick burn around the block, brought it inside, and tomorrow I'll change the valve covers, and there's so many other things to do. Like today I changed the trunk latch, and I need to put a master switch in on the power because I'm always opening the trunk, the battery's in the trunk. I open the trunk and disconnect the battery anytime it's in the garage because I don't trust it otherwise. Plus it has a clock that's running, so I don't want to run the battery down if it sits for a long time. And there's just so many things to do. I haven't got around to sound deadening. I didn't do the drive shaft loop yet. My parking brake at this point is a failure, but I'm close. I need more adjustment. I have it. I've adjusted it one more time today. I'm completely out of adjustment, and it's so close. It just starts to drag. You got to put a lot of preload on those cables. They're not dragging the brakes. It's got drum brakes in the back. They're not dragging yet, but man, when those cables get to where they're going to work, it's going to be on the verge of dragging the brakes. It's the Tri-Fi parking brake setup is, well, they improved it over the years for sure. But I guess that's enough rambling. Probably the last video on that for a while, other than maybe we'll do some driving with it, but who knows what we'll do. Again, so I didn't get to the bell housing, didn't get to the drive shaft loop, so there won't be any hole shots or power shifting. That's okay, we're just gonna go cruising. And that is the goal. All right, I'm tired and thirsty, and hope you have a wonderful evening, and I'll catch you soon.